It was the kind of summer afternoon that made you believe in the magic of small-town living. The air was thick with the scent of freshly cut grass, and the sun cast golden rays across the neatly trimmed lawns of Willow Creek, a quiet suburban neighborhood where everyone knew each other by name. Kids rode their bikes down the cul-de-sac, their laughter echoing through the streets, while the distant hum of lawnmowers and the occasional bark of a dog added to the symphony of suburban life. Today was special. Today was the annual Willow Creek Community Cookout, a tradition that had been going strong for over a decade. Every year, families would set up grills in their driveways, tables would overflow with potluck dishes, and the air would be filled with the sounds of laughter, music, and the sizzle of burgers and ribs. It was the one day of the year when the entire neighborhood came together to celebrate their community. Well, almost everyone. For the past 5 years, there had been one person who despised the cookout with every fiber of her being: Margaret Hargrove, the self-proclaimed queen of the Willow Creek Homeowners Association, HOA. Margaret was a woman who thrived on control, a dictator of arbitrary rules, and a master of making everyone's lives miserable. She was the kind of person who would fine a family for having a flag that wasn't aesthetically neutral or send passive-aggressive emails about the height of someone's grass. And this year, she had decided that the cookout would not happen. It started with petty warnings. A week before the cookout, Margaret began sending out emails to the entire neighborhood, warning them about unauthorized gatherings and violations of community event protocols. Her messages were filled with thinly veiled threats of fines and legal action if anyone dared to host the cookout without her explicit approval. The neighborhood collectively rolled their eyes. Everyone knew that the HOA had never actually enforced such a rule before. The cookout had always been a grassroots event, organized by the residents themselves, and Margaret's attempts to shut it down were nothing more than another power play. But Margaret wasn't one to back down. When the emails didn't work, she resorted to printed letters, which she personally slipped into every mailbox on the block. The letters stated that outdoor cooking was now prohibited without written HOA approval, and any violations would result in severe consequences. The residents of Willow Creek were used to Margaret's antics, but this was a new low. Still, they decided to ignore her. The cookout was happening, whether she liked it or not. On the day of the cookout, the neighborhood was buzzing with excitement. By noon, grills were fired up, music was playing, and the smell of burgers, ribs, and hot dogs filled the air. Kids ran through the yards with water guns, while adults lounged in lawn chairs, sipping cold drinks and catching up with their neighbors. It was a picture-perfect scene of community bonding. But Margaret was watching. From her porch, she observed the festivities with a look of pure disdain. She had spent years trying to impose order on what she saw as a chaotic and unruly neighborhood, and the cookout was the epitome of everything she hated. It was loud, messy, and completely outside her control. Clutching her clipboard like a weapon, Margaret marched down the street, her heels clicking against the pavement. She approached the first house, where the Johnson family was busy grilling burgers. Mr. Johnson, wearing an apron that read Grill Sergeant, was flipping patties with a smile on his face. "This is completely unacceptable," Margaret barked, pointing at the grill. "You are in direct violation of HOA regulations. Shut this down immediately, or face the consequences." Mr. Johnson chuckled, unfazed. "Margaret, it's a cookout, not a nightclub. Relax." Margaret's face turned red with rage. She began pointing at everything she deemed a violation: the speakers playing music, the coolers filled with drinks, the kids playing cornhole in the yard. Each one, according to her, was a breach of proper community standards. When no one obeyed her, Margaret did what she always did. She threatened fines. But this time, the neighbors had had enough. They knew Margaret had no real power. She was bluffing, and they weren't going to let her ruin their day. Furious and humiliated, Margaret pulled out her phone and dialed 911. In the most dramatic and falsely panicked voice imaginable, she reported a dangerous and illegal gathering that was causing major disturbances in the neighborhood. She claimed that people were out of control, that the HOA was being disrespected, and that the situation was escalating. The entire neighborhood watched in disbelief. Margaret had done a lot of ridiculous things over the years, but calling the police on a harmless cookout? This was next-level insanity. No one believed the cops would take her seriously. But then, in the distance, the sound of sirens cut through the summer air. The entire block fell silent as two police cruisers rolled into the cul-de-sac, their lights flashing but sirens mercifully off. Margaret stood on her porch, arms folded across her chest, a smug smile plastered on her face. She had done it. She had called the law to deal with the unruly peasants who had dared to defy her. The officers stepped out of their cars, their sunglasses reflecting the afternoon sun. They scanned the scene in front of them, clearly confused. Instead of the chaos Margaret had described, they were met with folding tables covered in potluck dishes, kids playing with water guns, and the distant sound of light jazz playing softly from a Bluetooth speaker. The lead officer, a tall man with a stoic expression, adjusted his sunglasses and spoke. "We got a call about a disturbance. Is there an issue here?" The entire block hesitated, waiting to see who would speak first. But before anyone could, Margaret took center stage. She marched across the street, clipboard in hand, and began her tirade. "Officers, thank goodness you're here. As you can see, this event is completely out of control. There are unauthorized grills, open flames, alcohol being consumed in public, excessive noise, and worst of all, this entire gathering is in direct violation of our homeowners association regulations." The officers exchanged a quick glance. The younger cop, barely concealing a smirk, tilted his head and asked, "You said out of control?" Margaret nodded vigorously. "Yes. People are completely disregarding community standards. These grills could be a fire hazard. There are people drinking." She gestured wildly toward a group of elderly neighbors holding plastic cups of lemonade. "And worst of all, there's music playing over the acceptable decibel limit." The lead officer stared at her, then at the speaker playing light jazz. He sighed, pulled out a small notepad, and said in the most deadpan voice imaginable, "All right, who's in charge here?" Before anyone else could step forward, Margaret leaped at the opportunity. I am the president of the Homeowners Association." There was a pause, a long, awkward pause. The lead officer flipped a page in his notebook, then looked back up. "Ma'am, this neighborhood doesn't have an HOA." The silence that followed could have knocked a bird out of the sky. Margaret's smile faltered. What? "We checked before we arrived." The officer continued, his voice laced with mild amusement. "This neighborhood voted against an HOA years ago. There's no legally recognized association here." Margaret's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. The neighbors, barely containing their laughter, exchanged knowing looks. Someone near the grill choked on a sip of beer. But Margaret, ever the stubborn tyrant, refused to back down. "That is completely incorrect. I have been running the HOA for the past 5 years." The lead officer nodded slowly. "Yeah, that's the problem." The younger officer, who had been holding back laughter, finally broke. "It means," he said, grinning, "that you're not in charge of anything." That was the moment the neighborhood lost it. The collective wave of laughter, suppressed chuckles, and even a few slow claps erupted all at once. Margaret's expression morphed into something between sheer humiliation and unfiltered rage. But she wasn't done yet. She squared her shoulders, pointed directly at the grills, and declared her final stand. "Fine. Then enforce the fire hazard violations. Those grills are illegal under local fire codes. If you don't shut this down, you're neglecting public safety." The officers looked at the grills, then at each other, then back at Margaret. And then, the lead officer did something no one expected. He removed his sunglasses, let out a long, exasperated sigh, and said, "Ma'am, we don't enforce HOA rules." Margaret blinked. "Excuse me. We do not enforce HOA rules," he repeated, emphasizing each word. "HOA rules are civil agreements between residents. They are not enforceable by the police." Margaret's jaw clenched. "That's ridiculous." The younger officer finally lost it. He let out a sharp laugh, quickly disguising it as a fake cough, but it was too late. The neighborhood had heard it, and a ripple of suppressed chuckles spread through the crowd. Margaret, realizing she had lost, went for the nuclear option. "Fine. If you refuse to enforce the law, I'll be reporting you for dereliction of duty and failure to maintain public safety standards. I demand your badge numbers." The lead officer calmly reached for his badge, unhooked it, and held it up. "Badge number 34719. Would you like my supervisor's number too? The younger officer grinned. Would you like mine as well? Maybe we can all file reports against each other. That was the breaking point. The entire neighborhood erupted in laughter, clapping and cheering as Margaret's paper-thin authority crumbled before their eyes. As the officers walked past Margaret and joined the cookout, grabbing plates of food and laughing with the neighbors, Margaret's world fell apart. She screamed, she ranted, she even tried to physically shove over a grill, but the officers stopped her, warning her that she could be charged with criminal mischief. Defeated and humiliated, Margaret retreated to her house, slamming the door so hard that a wreath fell off a neighboring house. The neighborhood cheered, the cookout continued, and for the first time in years, Willow Creek felt like a real community. But Margaret's downfall wasn't over. As the cookout wound down, a longtime resident named Susan Miller approached the officers with a stack of documents. It turned out that Margaret had been running a completely fake HOA for years, collecting thousands of dollars in fraudulent fees from unsuspecting neighbors. The officers, now armed with evidence, arrested Margaret for financial fraud. As she was escorted to the police car, the neighborhood erupted in cheers. The cookout became legendary, and Margaret's reign of terror was finally over. Margaret's downfall wasn't just about her getting caught. It was about an entire community standing together against someone who thought she could control everyone through fear and manipulation. In the end, she was left with nothing, while the rest of the neighborhood celebrated their freedom with burgers, drinks, and laughter. And that, as they say, was the best victory of all. The days following Margaret Hargrove's arrest were nothing short of euphoric for the residents of Willow Creek. The neighborhood, once stifled by her iron-fisted rule, now buzzed with a newfound sense of freedom and camaraderie. The annual cookout, which had become a symbol of resistance against Margaret's tyranny, was now celebrated as a victory festival. But as the dust settled, the residents realized that their work was far from over. Margaret's arrest was just the beginning. The neighborhood had to rebuild, reclaim its identity, and ensure that no one like Margaret could ever rise to power again. Margaret's arrest sent shockwaves through Willow Creek, but it also opened a Pandora's box of revelations. As the police dug deeper into her fraudulent activities, they uncovered a web of deceit that extended far beyond the fake HOA. Margaret had been embezzling funds for years, using the money to fund her lavish lifestyle, designer clothes, luxury vacations, and even a brand new SUV that she claimed was a community vehicle for HOA business. The investigation also revealed that Margaret had been forging documents, creating fake meeting minutes, and even impersonating city officials to intimidate residents into paying her fees. The scale of her deception was staggering, and the neighborhood was left reeling. Many residents, especially newcomers who had been bullied into compliance, felt a mix of anger and relief. They had been living under the thumb of a con artist, and now, finally, the truth was out. Susan Miller, the longtime resident who had exposed Margaret's fraud, became an overnight hero. She had spent years quietly collecting evidence, waiting for the right moment to strike. Now, with Margaret behind bars, Susan found herself at the center of the neighborhood's efforts to rebuild. While most residents were eager to move on, not everyone was ready to forgive and forget. Margaret's arrest had exposed deep divisions within the community. Some residents, particularly those who had supported her or turned a blind eye to her behavior, felt guilty and defensive. Others, like the Johnson family, were furious that Margaret had been allowed to operate unchecked for so long. At a community meeting held in the local park, tensions ran high. The topic of discussion: how to prevent another Margaret from taking over. "We need to establish a real HOA," argued Mr. Davenport, the retired lawyer who had helped draft the official complaint against Margaret. "But this time, it needs to be transparent, democratic, and accountable. No more dictators." "An HOA?" scoffed Mrs. Johnson, her arms crossed. "After everything we've been through? No way. HOAs are nothing but trouble. We don't need more rules, we need less." The debate raged on, with residents split into two camps: those who wanted a formal HOA to protect the neighborhood's interests, and those who believed that any form of organized governance would lead to another Margaret. Amid the chaos, Susan Miller emerged as a unifying figure. She had no desire to be a leader, but her role in exposing Margaret's fraud had thrust her into the spotlight. Reluctantly, she agreed to chair a temporary committee tasked with drafting a new set of community guidelines. Susan's approach was pragmatic and inclusive. She organized town hall meetings, invited input from every household, and made sure that every voice was heard. Her goal was simple: to create a system that balanced freedom with responsibility, one that protected the neighborhood without stifling it. One of her first proposals was to establish a neighborhood watch program, not just for security, but also to foster a sense of community. She also suggested creating a community fund, where residents could voluntarily contribute to shared projects like park maintenance, street repairs, and seasonal events. "This isn't about control," Susan explained at one meeting. "It's about collaboration. We're not here to tell you what to do. We're here to help you do what you want, together." Her words resonated with many, and slowly but surely, the neighborhood began to heal. Meanwhile, Margaret's trial became the talk of the town. The prosecution had a mountain of evidence against her, including bank statements, forged documents, and testimony from dozens of residents. Margaret, ever the narcissist, tried to play the victim, claiming that she had been misunderstood and that her actions were for the good of the community. But her defense fell flat. The jury saw through her lies, and after a short deliberation, she was found guilty on multiple counts of fraud, embezzlement, and forgery. The judge, unimpressed by her lack of remorse, sentenced her to 5 years in prison and ordered her to repay the stolen funds. As Margaret was led away in handcuffs, the residents of Willow Creek felt a collective sense of closure. The tyrant was gone, and the neighborhood could finally move forward. With Margaret out of the picture, the residents decided to turn the annual Cookout into a full-blown Willow Creek Freedom Festival. The event, held on the first Saturday of every summer, became a celebration of community, resilience, and independence. The first Freedom Festival was a massive success. The streets were lined with food stalls, games, and live music. Kids ran through sprinklers, adults competed in a chili cook-off, and even the local police officers showed up to enjoy the festivities. At the center of it all was a large banner that read, "Welcome to Willow Creek, where freedom thrives." In the end, Margaret Hargrove's reign of terror had an unexpected silver lining. It brought the residents of Willow Creek closer together, teaching them the importance of standing up for what's right and the power of community. As Susan Miller put it at the first Freedom Festival, Margaret tried to divide us, but she failed. She thought she could control us, but she underestimated us. Today, we're not just celebrating our freedom, we're celebrating each other. And with that, the neighborhood raised their glasses, toasting to a brighter future. Years later, Willow Creek is a thriving, tight-knit community. The Freedom Festival has become a beloved tradition, and the Neighborhood Watch program has helped keep the streets safe and clean. The Community Fund has financed numerous projects, including a new playground, a community garden, and even a small library. As for Margaret Hargrove, she was released from prison after serving her sentence. She moved to a different town, far from Willow Creek, and was never heard from again. Some say she tried to start a new HOA, but her reputation preceded her, and no one was willing to give her a second chance. Back in Willow Creek, life goes on. The grills are fired up, the music plays, and the laughter of children fills the air. The neighborhood has learned its lesson, that true freedom comes not from rules and regulations, but from trust, respect, and the willingness to stand together. And so, under the golden rays of the summer sun, Willow Creek remains a place where freedom thrives, and where the memory of Margaret Hargrove serves as a reminder of what can happen when a community stands united. Thank you for taking the time to listen to today's story on Store of Good Stories. If this story touched your heart or made you think, don't forget to hit like and share the video to spread this positive message to more people. And if this is your first time here, make sure to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss any of the meaningful stories we share every week. Your support is the biggest motivation for Store of Good Stories to keep bringing heartfelt and valuable stories to you. See you in the next video.